Welcome to Washington. I hope you've had a chance to enjoy the beautiful cherry blossoms and the nice weather. You can tell that for those of us who live and work here, we do so because of the kind of lifestyle. It's really great to sort of see and feel the energy in this room, to see so many people who are committed to searching for the solutions to some of the world's most significant problems and who understand the concept of global interdependence. As Jane said, my name is Ruth Levine, and I'm Director of Programs at the Center for Global Development, which sort of is an institution that shares some DNA with many of the organizations that your foundations and organizations support. We were founded by Ed Scott, who you'll hear from tomorrow. He started to provide resources to work on policy issues because he was frustrated with the limitations of what he could do through direct philanthropy in Central America and elsewhere. So I think that he will be a very good and interesting speaker for you tomorrow. In this panel, what we're going to look at and hear about is the role of policy research and development, how research can influence policy in specific ways. And like R&D for products, R&D for things that we may be more familiar with, and think about R&D for the kind of research and development process associated with policy starts with ideas, starts with an observation about a problem in the world and ideas about how to solve it, but then involves a lot of interaction, a lot of people, a lot of communication, and a tremendous amount of translation in different ways to make sure that the policy research findings make their way into real-world action, and we'll hear about much of that today. I'd just like to highlight three barriers or constraints that are faced in that translational process from research to policy. One is vocabulary. Often those who are undertaking the research don't share a language with those who are making policy and programmatic decisions, either in developed countries or in the developing world. So there's a challenge of even getting on the same page to communicate. Second is time frame. Often the research enterprise takes a rather long view, often takes a considerable number of months or years to undertake, whereas policy decisions are happening today whether or not there's good evidence and information to back them up. And the third very important sort of challenge or obstacle is around context. How can research be shaped to inform decisions in a particular context when perhaps the research was done elsewhere? There's a particular challenge for work in the developing world where much of our knowledge is derived from outside the environment where we're trying to encourage its use. So with that, I'm honored to moderate this really exciting panel of three distinguished individuals who together have a real breadth and depth of experience in this area. I'll just briefly introduce them. Andrew Natsios is professor in the practice of diplomacy at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University nearby, and he's just recently left the position of administrator of USAID. Jessica Mathews is president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Pedro Sanchez is director of the tropical agriculture and senior research scholar at the Earth Institute at Columbia University, and works on the Millennium Village project at the Earth Institute, which I believe he will be speaking about today. So please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Andrew Natsios.
Thank you very much. What I thought I would do today is something a little different from me. Normally I give a more sort of abstract, broad description of what's going on in the world. I'm going to focus in more precisely on some problems which this audience probably more than any other would know from personal experience, and that is the question of absorptive capacity, weak or non-existent institutions in many of the countries we work in. What do we do about it? The World Bank estimates there are about 2 billion people in fragile states, fragile or failing states. We and DFID, the British Aid Agency, well, keep saying we, I haven't got out of the, we does not mean Georgetown in the context of this speech. I haven't properly left mentally from AID, so even though I'm not representing the institution, I keep saying we. AID has done similar research, so it's the World Bank, it's DFID, it's AID. Other institutions have too. I'm not suggesting they haven't, but they've reached similar conclusions on the number of fragile states. There are about 50 to 55. There's a set of indicators that are generally accepted now in the research centers on what a fragile state is and how you document it and what happens, what causes it and how you deal with it in a broad sense. But in a specific sense, we're only now redesigning our systems to deal with state fragility. What we have done in the past is most of us have treated all countries the same. We focused essentially on sectors. The problem with doing that is there's a huge difference between Liberia and Ghana. There's a huge difference between Mali and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And if you treat both countries, no matter what sector you're in, what area you're in those countries, you're making a huge developmental mistake because the countries can't handle the same interventions the same way because of the different stage of development that they're at. Now, we've had a massive increase in foreign aid and just in the U.S. government. In 2000, the total funding was $10 billion. Last year, it was $27.5 billion. It's going to continue to rise for a few more years, depending on what happens in Congress this year. The European donors are putting more money in. And I might add that we started this whole effort in AID called the Global Development Alliance, where we have partnered with many of you, in which we've put $1.1 billion with non-traditional partner organizations. And the private sector, private foreign aid, has put in $3.7 billion, almost $5 billion, in 300 alliances, which are very interesting without going into the details of it. The point I'm trying to make is a lot more money is going into the developing world. All the commitments have been made at Monterey. The United States has grossly exceeded what the pledge was of the president. We're way above everyone else in terms of the growth. Now, people would argue we're at a much lower level in terms of our GNP. I've always argued that using GNP as a way of determining how much foreign aid program is the most irrational way I could possibly imagine. It means that countries whose economies are in decline, in some European countries, are stagnant, have a completely different challenge facing them than those of us with fairly robust economies. We are now pouring money into two countries in the United States, and that is to Afghanistan and Iraq. Last year, AID alone obligated $1.5 billion, just AID. This does not include the European donors or the World Bank or anyone else. And I can tell you we now have a test tube in Afghanistan for the kinds of challenges we are going to face in other countries. We put even more money in Iraq, but let's put Iraq aside for a minute. It's more controversial. There isn't agreement on things there, and we put a large amount of money. We put just $1.5 billion into Afghanistan. We have very serious absorptive capacity problems that people are not discussing publicly. A lot of the people advocating more foreign aid, and I believe in more foreign aid, but I think the notion of determining this by a percentage of your gross national product is dangerous because it has no relationship to whether the capacity exists in the country to absorb the money. Let me tell you the kinds of problems we're having. We are spending a huge amount of money in construction right now in Afghanistan for schools, health clinics, and roads. One institution, not AID, built 12 schools, and several of them collapsed within, and no one was in them, thank God, within several days of their being built. Essentially because construction companies that are not really construction companies are taking the money. They actually did the building, and the thing collapsed. Not in a storm. I mean, it was within 2 weeks. The walls just gave way and they collapsed because they don't have engineers. They don't have enough engineers. And the construction companies that are in this business do not, in fact, know how to construct buildings. Now, this is more serious than people want to talk about. It's a problem with rural road construction now. We have set up a whole training system, I think working with DFID, the British aid agency, just training construction companies, private for-profit Afghan construction companies, because there aren't enough to absorb the money we're putting into the country. So if we use Afghanistan as a leitmotif for what we're going to face in other countries, we're going to have serious capacity problems in fragile states. 2 billion people live in fragile states. There are 50 of them. This is not a small number of countries. It's not just the Liberias of the world. It's more serious than that because it's a much larger number of countries. These are countries with fragile public institutions and a fragile level of capacity in NGOs, in community groups, and we've learned a series of things in AID through a lot of pain over the last 15 years since there were scandals in the late 1980s and a number of aid programs. And what I want to do now is not tell you the problem, but how we've come up with some protocols to fix it. Well, this is a very practical lecture on what we have done to try to deal with this issue of absorptive capacity. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't spend more money. I'm suggesting we need to gear the money to the absorptive capacity of the country. And that means carefully analyzing how many construction companies, if you're doing construction, how many are there, and what level of competence are they at in a variety of areas. Because if we don't do that, we're going to have failures in this next round of growth in ODA that are going to be so substantial that they will create scandals in the West that will collapse the whole effort to increase foreign aid. I'm very worried about this, and I think you should be worried about this, because the more money that's put in, the more we are at risk from this phenomenon taking place. There are two things that happen when you push too much money in fragile or non-existent institutions. You either have high rates of inflation, which we are experiencing in both in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and in a couple of other countries where we've put a lot of money very rapidly. You have a lot of the money absorbed into very high inflation rates with no improvement in the quality of services or construction or anything else, because it's basically being eaten up by the inflation. The second thing you have is corruption, widespread corruption, which is extremely destructive in the development process, because the message being sent is the Westerners are now saying it's okay to steal all this money, no problem, just keep pushing the money in, the systems are fine, we will worry about this stuff later on. What have we done about it? Some of these are from things I have run myself over the last 15 years. You need to design a business system in whatever institution you have to minimize risk and build capacity simultaneously. In AID, we had a process, I have a process now called pre-award review. Now, it takes a long time to do this for a new NGO, a local NGO that's never worked with AID, or a new university that's never been. This is for new partners that have never done this before. A team is sent in, and the team is composed of financial management people, procurement specialists, and CTOs. CTOs are cognizant technical officers. This is a term of art in the federal government. I have no idea whoever invented this term. They're basically contract compliance officers. Okay? They're on the technical side, not on the management side as much, to see whether or not the project's on track to do what the requirements of the program are. And when you're spending, our budget increased basically by 60 or 70% in 4 years. And we've had this problem around the world, and we're using this system now to deal with it. But imagine instead of our budget doubling, it tripled or quadrupled. Then this would take place on a massive scale. And as you push more money in, the problem will become geometrically more severe. So you send the team in, they look at these things. Is there internal controls to make sure that more than one person's approving things so no one steals money? Do you have a planning capacity to think through things like the weather? Like, is the road system sufficient to bring in the commodities you need to build a school? I have some very amusing but disturbing pictures of our trucks going into remote areas of Afghanistan to build a school, and all you can see is the top foot of the truck, which is full of bricks, fired bricks, because the rest of it's in mud, and it will never come out of that mud. It will be there forever. In fact, someone will see this as an archaeological dig in 1,000 years, this truck that's in this mud. Because in the planning that was done by the subcontractor that was local, they did not look into the road conditions. They don't do that kind of logistics planning in some of these companies. It's amusing, but no one was killed in this, but it was very disturbing that we've lost the truck and all the bricks in this non-existent road because it's basically mud. Do the staff have the skills needed to carry the programs out? Are there engineers on the project? Are there medical doctors? Are there educators who can actually carry out the grant? So is there technical capacity? Is there a financial management system to record the expenditure of resources? Now, the second thing that's done after you look internally at the institutions is to review past applicants with other institutions. In other words, if there's a construction company that we're doing work with the first time, or a local NGO, have they gotten money from UNICEF or DFID or the European Union or the World Bank? Because if they had, you find out whether or not there are ethics violations, whether they were fired, whether people were arrested, or whether they have a very clean record and have a very sterling ability to carry the programs out. Because past record makes a huge difference. Is half the senior leadership of the institution in jail? And if you're in jail in Afghanistan, you have to really be, because there aren't that many jails, have done some pretty bad things. So is there a history of ethics problems in the institution? And you need a high level of sharing of information among international institution donors in order to exchange this kind of information, hopefully without lawsuits. In the United States, if you shared information like that, you'd be in jail, not the person committing the problem, because you have shared information. We don't have that problem yet in most of these countries where you can't share information without getting into legal trouble. We normally will ask 3 years of an audited financial statement. In many of these countries, there are no CPAs. We require a CPA. So, we are flexible in these rules depending on how big the grant is and what the institution is. We look at also these other internal systems. Is there a property management system? Is there an inventory control system? Is there an internal procurement system that actually exists, that's been tested, that works? And then at the end, an agreement officer makes a certification that these institutions can absorb money according to AID and OMB standards. Now, I'm not suggesting you adopt AID or OMB standards, but having a checklist where you actually check to see whether these systems are in place and they're functioning and they work would make a huge amount of difference. Now, some more practical things that AID does to minimize risk. I remember in 1992 going into Somalia. I ran the humanitarian aid program for the president's father in Somalia in 1992. And I remember going into Mogadishu, seeing a school in the middle of a civil war functioning with 10 classrooms full of grammar school children. And I went up to the ICRC delegate and I said, "What's that? All the schools are shut down." He said, "No, the schools aren't shut down. There are 30,000 kids in school." I said, "Really? How does that work?" He said, "Well, I don't want to tell you, Andrew, because you shut down the food supply, because you control it." I said, "So what's going on here?" He said, "Well, these women don't want their kids in the streets because they get shot and they're not getting their education. So they took the school buildings, called the teachers back, and they're giving them a food for work program, which is the teachers getting food for teaching, using your food, which we've agreed to be the fiduciary agent for." I said, "I think it's a wonderful idea. I won't tell anyone if you don't tell anyone. This is an emergency program. You're supposed to just distribute the food, but that's fine with me." And we started giving, through the ICRC and other NGOs, small grants of $10,000 to $15,000 each to women's groups to set the schools back up. And they were spectacularly successful. So we put more money into it, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. Guess what happened? The warlords found out that the women had $50,000, and guess what? None of the women were safe anymore. Small amounts of money don't attract attention. Large amounts do. So what we realize is if it's less than $15,000 in Somalia under those circumstances, it works. More than that, you get into very serious trouble. Another thing we do is to contract with technical assistance officers. We have central contracts. I did this 5 years ago when we started. We wanted an easy mechanism for mission directors to go in to get technical help without procuring it. So we have a centralized contract where any mission director, in order to train a local NGO or a local contractor, can bring in technical expertise just by sending a note to Washington saying, "Here's the money, bring them in. I need them to help me get these NGOs that are local and new up to speed on these systems." So there's training for staff. There is institutional mentoring by having new partners first act as sub-grantees or subcontractors with established NGOs or contractor institutions that AID does work with, so they can teach them how to do this stuff. There's also a wonderful thing that my good friend Hamdi Atmar, who is the Minister of Rural Development in Afghanistan, one of the most able cabinet ministers, has done. He knew about our concerns about this stuff, and so he set up, he has, I don't want to give advertisement to an American company, but it's an American contracting firm, consulting firm we do work with around the world, to set up the fiduciary system for managing a massive program of local grants, small amounts of grant money, to villages and towns to build small infrastructure projects. They're very simple projects. The town has to go through a process to make the decision. Women have to be involved. It's a wonderful program. He came up with it himself. But he said, you know, Andrew, I know if you give me the money, we're going to have problems. So you have an American company that knows how to do this mentoring and record keeping come in. They control the money, and by doing that, we can reduce risk and yet do the capacity building to increase the capacity of our government to absorb some of this money. Final point. If you don't take some risks, you won't build local capacity in indigenous institutions, which is what development's about. If you accept too much risk and scandals take place, the money is misused or disappears, and the programs will be shut down. We have less political willingness in this country to accept corruption. And in fact, there's probably less corruption in the AID program than almost any other institution. I'm not bragging about that. It's because of the IG setting up systems 15 years ago saying we can't go through this again. We are going to impose this on you. It is onerous, but it does work. And so there's is there occasionally? Yes. But is there a serious problem with leakage in our programming? There is not, systemically. And in fact, if you look at the audits that were done of our program in Iraq, there were no systemic scandal in any of the AID programming in Iraq because we kept all these systems in place that we use everywhere else in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Now let me welcome Jessica Mathews.
Is it all right if I talk? Okay. First, let me say that it's a privilege to be here in a room full of people who are trying to make a difference in the world. I've spent my life on it in a think tank context, and largely, and I know how difficult it is, and I admire everything that you are doing, and particularly Jane Wales for creating this forum. Organizers posed for us a series of questions which are not in the program. So briefly, what are the challenges to in the developing world to basing policy on research, on objective research? How can policy research carried out in the developed world be adapted and contextualized in the developing world? How can policy research build a bigger constituency for right policies, et cetera? How can think tanks in the developed world collaborate with their counterparts in the developing world? Those are the questions that I want to try to address with you. I want to start by looking at what I think is the strategic context in which we are all operating. And I'm speaking here to the Americans in the room, and I recognize some of this is not appropriate then for some of you. But for those of us working on policy advice and in the world of ideas, it's a particularly delicate business because it's obviously highly intrusive and highly obvious policy relevant. One of my colleagues at Carnegie has a sign on his desk which is our sort of central dogma, and it says outputs does not equal outcomes. So the kind of policy research I'm talking about is the kind that is formulated, carried out, and intended to affect government policy. That is obviously a delicate business. And this is an unusual historical moment to do this kind of work, I think, for the following reasons. One is that because of globalization and a number of related changes and evolving values over the last few decades, sovereignty, national sovereignty, is being challenged, is challenged in a way it hasn't been before. That creates a very palpable feeling of tension and unease in the world, and of sensitivity to, in many contexts, to outside, what can be seen as outside interference or outside advice. It's an important thing to be aware of because it does affect the receptivity to what one is trying to do. Secondly, we are now in a world, very, very recent, where we've gone from two superpowers to one global hegemon. that transition is a completely different world. Because hegemons always provoke resistance. They provoke blocking coalitions. They provoke resentment and fear. And that's a phenomenon throughout history. Global hegemony is historically very different, very difficult territory. All those, and it's very few that have attempted it, have failed sooner or later. And it is a sensitive territory that requires, I think, an appreciation of where we are. And third, we are an unusual hegemon, partly because we have unprecedented power, relative power to the rest of the world, partly because we have deep ambivalence about being a hegemon, partly because we have a very limited attention span, which is related to this ambivalence, and partly also because we have pivoted rather dramatically from a period of 4 or 5 decades in which we invested an enormous amount of political capital and money in building international public goods. And since the end of the Cold War, and more particularly in the last 8 years, or the last half dozen years, we have turned against many of the institutions and instruments that we spent a great deal of time and money building. This has created also a good deal of resentment and fear and confusion, and difficulty in addressing some problems that many of you work on. There are different ways to respond to this situation. I just want to begin by saying it's always very much in my mind as I try to formulate what we're doing at Carnegie, and I think it needs to be in everybody's mind if you want to have payoff from what you're doing. Let me turn also now to some of the less strategic, maybe slightly more tactical questions of how you make a difference with think tanks operating in the developed world, where your target is developing countries or is developing countries. First, I would say that the answer depends very heavily on the field. There are some fields, and principally environment, but also to some extent human rights, perhaps women's issues, although that may be borderline, where it is more possible to have a bigger impact outside of government, which makes working in those fields easier than in areas as in peace and security, democratization, foreign policy issues, where one cannot work outside of governments and where issues of nationalism come into play and are much more sensitive. Secondly, let me go through a list. I think Ruth mentioned some of them that are particularly related to problems of policy research that are on the tactical end, but important. One is the problem of absorption in a different sense than Andrew was talking about, of the not invented here syndrome. Is the research relevant? Is it not that is it relevant in its content, but in its ability to be appreciated on the audience that you're addressing? And in our early years at the World Resources Institute, we did a major study on the costs of tropical deforestation. And our principal interest there was Brazil, for obvious reasons. We couldn't get any traction with what we felt were really important research results. We in effect redid the study with a Brazilian colleague who became one of the lead co-authors. It was almost the same study, not quite. But we republished it in a different frame. And with the Brazilian co-author, it helped to have a change Brazilian government policy in a very short order. That was a particularly successful endeavor of this, but it illustrates the problem. On the other hand, one thing I've learned in 2 decades in this business, that in many countries, think tanks operate in a highly competitive environment where collaborating between your institution and any one you pick means that you rule out the audience of all the others. This is an awful problem in Mexico, for example. It's a problem in Russia, where we currently work. It's a problem in many, many, many countries. Third, from the point of view of a recipient and a donor, collaborations developed to developing world mean a vastly unequal cost between the two. So if the effort is 50-50, the costs may be 90-10, and that creates a big problem. Another is the problem of token representation. How do you, if you want to get representation in a study, but you've got 20 workers in Washington and 3 in the developing world, usually what happens to those, you in fact don't get anything meaningful because those on the other side are perfectly aware that their role is token representation. A bigger problem is brain drain in an unanticipated way, but a really serious one, I think. And that is, as Andrew mentioned, many of the societies in which one wants to work are thin in terms of the professional elite that is relevant to the policy research. And a handful of key people then get gobbled up and really devoured by the international advice-giving business in a way that really pulls them away from their research and their most useful role that made them recognized in the first place. What this ends up doing is achieving the opposite of what you're trying to do, which is to build capacity, and is a really serious problem. And finally, there is the problem of follow-up. I've always believed that the only way to have outcomes from policy research is to view the book, the analysis, the report, the printed product as, say, 2/3 of the way through the project, or maybe 60%, and the other 40% is getting the results into people's hands and heads and into policy. It's much, much harder then to do that from a distance. So let me mention 2 alternative ways of operating that I've found over some years of that get around some of these problems. The one is, the first and the most important, I think, is trying to establish an on-the-ground presence for doing policy research, rather than trying to do it either on a project-by-project basis or sustained collaboration from a distance. This is obvious for those of you who work on humanitarian aid or for service delivery or for even, to some extent, advocacy. It is very, very rare in the think tank world. There are some obvious reasons for that. It's expensive. It's slow. You need to be really patient to have an impact. You require language fluency. It requires the dedication and the funding, which is very hard to find, to translate everything you do, both directions. It requires an enormous amount of sophistication and knowledge of the society you're getting into before you start, or else you make terrible mistakes. And it can be very risky, as we're finding, for example, in a current situation in Russia, where Carnegie has an office of 42 people, 41 of them Russians and 1 American. But there is absolutely no substitute, I think, for good policy research when you're really looking at a particular region or particular country for an on-the-ground presence sustained over a long period of time. The level of fine-tuning and sophistication and understanding, the depth of understanding of policy is just completely different. And let me just also mention one word, since you're all here, about this translation point of view. It's true that English is a global language, but believe me that it makes an immense difference if you're doing research and interacting in the language of the country you're trying to operate in or the region. I found, to my amazement, when I started at Carnegie, that it was impossible to raise money for translations. Even though 95% of the work was already done, and you were talking an additional 5% that would double the audience. I thought that was a fabulous deal that anybody would want to do, and in fact, I found that nobody wanted to. And so we've had to invent a lot of ways of doing it, but I'm convinced that it's absolutely critical. We currently have websites as well as publications in Russian, Chinese, and Arabic, which is where we are concentrating our regional work. And finally, I'm told I have 0 minutes.
That's
Do I have
okay.
30
Keep
seconds?
going. Sure. I was just trying to.
I know. There is, in addition to those issues that make sense in a regional or a national context, there are a number of issues, obviously, that can only be addressed in a global one. And many of them are issues that you all work on, non-proliferation, which we do, climate change, health issues. There are a number of them. Obviously, you can't have an on-the-ground presence to try to develop solutions that will gather the support of large numbers of countries and make it possible to reach solutions. There, I think that the only, or let me describe briefly a study we did, which was our best shot at how to do this on nuclear proliferation, where we'd spent 1.5 years developing what we felt was the framework of a coherent global policy. But we felt that since any policy could only be successful if it really garnered global support, we published it as a draft in a formal publication, and then we took it around the world to 20 countries. And we met with governments, we met with experts, we met with academics, we met with all, and then we rewrote it and republished it. We obviously meant it that we were serious, that we wanted people's comments, and we got swamped with useful comments, and it was really a different and a very much better policy on the second time round. So I think there are innovations in process that one can think about how to be genuine on those issues that do require global cooperation, and that where you can't expect a global presence. So let me stop there. Sorry, go.
No, that's okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, here we go. And the big problem is global poverty. I'll restrict it to Africa, where the part of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, that has the least chances by everybody to meet the agreed upon Millennium Development Goals. And, by the way, this was a grand policy research exercise involving over 300 people in 10 task forces from all over the world for a couple of years. The recommendations gave it political legitimacy because all countries in the world signed for the goals. It is science-based, which is the bottom line of my talk. How do you bring science to bear on development? It is compelling and it's integral. It brings all sectors together. It has quantitative targets. Half the proportion of malnourished children as measured by underweight children under the age of 5 by 2015. It has a deadline and it has a hotspots approach. In addition to that, Secretary General Kofi Annan called for an African green revolution, very different from the Asian one of 40 years ago, and gave it additional political impetus. This green revolution that he called for a couple of years ago in Ethiopia involves agriculture, nutrition, markets, environment, policies, and politics. So it's a much broader based one than before. The estimated costs for rural Africa, according to the Millennium Project recommendations, are indeed a large investment. They require, our recommendation is about $110 per capita per year over the next 10 years to achieve all the goals, health, education, agriculture, etc., of which the household share is $10. The government's share is about $30, which is about 3 times as much what they do right now. And the donor share, the rest of us, $70, and even that is broken down in so much for agricultural nutrition, health, infrastructure, education, water, sanitation, the environment, etc. Now, an opportunity has come to answer the question, how about if we really try to do it? How about if we put all this stuff to practice? And this, this is happening at two scales. At the national scale, indeed doing policy research with the national governments, and at the community scale to what has become known as the Millennium Villages. The bottom line of the Millennium Villages idea is there. The community leads with a very strong community structure that gets empowered by the outsiders, and it is science-based. Some of the key problems or challenges that we learn along the way is that unlike the previous green revolution in Asia, Latin America, where the main problems was that you needed new types, a new architecture of the wheat and the rice plant, Africa's main profound biological, biophysical problems, I'm not talking about social issues, but the biophysical issues, is that the soils are not healthy, they're depleted of nutrients, and they're eroding away. And we have untamed water, either too much or too little, both pictures within kilometers of each other, but one during the rainy season, one during the dry season in Niger. Another is a paradigm shift. And in Malawi this year, we have found that as you go down the food chain from soil, water, seeds, down to crops, harvested, markets, processing, supermarkets, if they're there, cooking, eating, and utilization, that to supply their 2 million very hungry, impoverished families in Malawi right now, to supply them with food aid would cost about $400 per family. To invest at the front end of the food chain with things like fertilizers, agroforestry, irrigation, improved seeds, it would cost about $60 per family. 60 versus 400. Any economist will tell you that if you invest at the front end of any chain, you're going to have all sorts of good positive feedbacks at the last end. This is something Andrew Natsios was trying to do when he was head at AID in one of his programs for school lunches with locally produced foods. But I think the time has come to really seriously look at that from an investment point of view. Let's do smart aid. Safe drinking water is another key intervention. Fairly simple technologies on the left side in Malawi, on the right side, what I saw in Rwanda about a couple of weeks ago at the beginning of the rainy season. Couldn't be more unhealthy. And another major one is homegrown school feeding programs. The benefits of good child nutrition in primary and nursery schools is just amazing. It attracts girls to school, it retains girls in school, everybody benefits in terms of improved grades, and if you make them homegrown as opposed to being shipping it from Iowa, let's say, then you generate an internal market there, buying food of locally accepted stuff and also of balanced nutritional quality from the local people, generating a good market. So this is another one of the real exciting findings. And finally is a transformation. I think what we're after in rural Africa is a transformation from subsistence farming, and I wouldn't even call subsistence, because people who are hungry 7 to 3 months a year are below subsistence and are sick with malaria and AIDS and neglected tropical diseases, and you cannot call these people subsistence. From subsistence to small-scale entrepreneurs. What you see there are pictures in one of the villages that has been very successful in food production, and now they're talking to the head of a seed production company there about becoming themselves seed producers of open pollinated, not hybrid, not transgenics varieties of corn, and selling things like agroforestry seeds and electricity going in. It is this transformation that will be the key to sustainability of what we're talking about here. One of the keys. In the case of Malawi, there have been some major policy shifts in which several of us working with the World Bank convinced the government of Malawi that they should go back into fertilizer and seed subsidies, something they've abandoned before. They did a 75% subsidies. Bags of fertilizer like that were distributed to about 900,000 Malawian farmers this planting season that is just about ready to be harvested. And what you see in Malawi now, also thanks to a good rainy season, is a totally different story what you see before. We're foreseeing very large harvests, and everybody now is geared at the issue: how do you store? How do you make sure that the prices don't collapse? You use cereal banks and other techniques, but that these highly hungry people are going to be able to make it this year, they certainly will. In the older Millennium Village, Sauri, where it's been going on for 2 years, we learned many lessons. The villages are increasingly assuming ownership and responsibility. They sound like a government now. They have their Department of Agriculture, Health, Roads, Education, information, etc. They've organized themselves that way. Everything is done through town meetings. And the first town meeting about 2 years ago, when we came in, explained the Millennium Development Goals, wanted to know if they wanted to work with us, and asking what their main needs are. They said they needed farm inputs and they needed a clinic, first and foremost. We said, you want a clinic? Build one. Go to the Ministry of Health, get yourself plans for a proper clinic and build it. The so-called project, the investor from the outside, who never transfers cash, transfers commodities, provided the zinc roofs, the paint, the cement, a diesel generator. The rest they did, including building the bricks. They carried them on their heads, Andrew, so no trucks were stuck in the mud, although there was plenty of mud there. And in 6 weeks, they built a clinic for less than $10,000. The Ministry of Health has come in. The USAID PEPFAR program has come in with antiretroviral drugs. This is an area with 30% adult HIV/AIDS infection. Anti-malaria, long-lasting malaria bed nets were distributed for free. It's a public good, just like vaccines. And now everybody in the village, about 5,000 people, there are 3,000 bed nets, everybody's sleeping under a long-lasting insecticide. Insecticide is put inside the fibers of these things. They last for 5 years. Malaria bed nets, they kill the mosquitoes. The lab technician provided by the Ministry of Health there is saying that the incidence of malaria in blood tests has gone down dramatically. In agriculture, on my part, combining the best that science could offer in terms of hybrid maize seed, in terms of fertilizers, in terms of agroforestry, in terms of spacing, agronomics. The July 2005 harvest was average 4.9 tons per hectare in 327 hectares. The previous year was 1.9 tons per hectare in 229 hectares. Production increased 3.5 times, and nobody is hungry anymore. This has been repeated, just recently harvested crop in another village in Ethiopia, in northern Ethiopia, and certainly the Malawian one is on its way. All I'm trying to say here, and this is the end of my talk, all I'm trying to say here is that when you bring science, because all this is science-based, to bear together with community responsibility, and you invest at scale, because community development projects like this have been done before, but the best we could figure out, the per capita investment was in the order of $1 to $5 per year. When you invest at scale, things happen. You see the empowerment in these people's faces. They now want a polytechnic, a vocational high school. They're talking about crop diversification. They even started giving a small food aid program because they heard there are people in Kenya who are starving right now. So the whole thing has been a transformation. It's too early to call it victory, but we think it's a good way of bringing together what the best of policy research has recommended with a political commitment and bringing science and community participation together. Thanks, Ruth.
very much, Pedro. Well, this has been what I would call a wide-ranging panel, geographically and in terms of content. I'm sure many of you have questions and perhaps comments. So, given that we have about 20 minutes or so, with the indulgence of the organizers, I'm going to skip my question, if that's okay, and go directly to any questions from the audience. If you have a question, raise your hand, and a member of the staff will come to you with a microphone. And if you could state your name and affiliation, and then ask a question and leave time for comments, that would be great. And if you don't have questions, then I certainly do. So I'm happy to go.
Hi, I'm Andrew Cooper from Ashoka. I wanted to ask Andrew Natsios about how you're understanding absorptive capacity, given that one of the themes of this conference is social entrepreneurship. If you look at an example like Bangladesh, you might say, here's a failed state, significant amounts of corruption, etc. And yet one of the most remarkable development stories there in the last few decades, you have life expectancy going from 47 to 63. And what's the real story there? Well, it's two great social entrepreneurs, Muhammad Yunus and Faisal Abed, who have really been able to deliver services at an unprecedented scale. What I didn't hear, I guess, in your list, and that's what I wanted to ask you about, is this sense of the people rather than the policies. I recognize you mentioned some skills and some capacity building, but the sense of how do you find what AID and others are doing more to say, let's back these social entrepreneurs, let's find these people, because we know there may be corruption, there may be all sorts of things, but if you put the money and the help into Yunus and Abed, you can be sure there's going to be a kind of ethical and effective and scaled response. So what are you doing more to think about that, and how can all of us think about that in a better way?
It depends. You have to contextualize this based on the country you're in. Afghanistan is still in the middle of a war. Bangladesh may be headed for one, but I mean, there's instability growing, unfortunately, because of some external forces that are at work in a very bad sense in Bangladesh. But Bangladesh is not in the middle of a civil war. It doesn't have, in the Hazarajat in Afghanistan, there's 10 feet of snow in the wintertime, sometimes 20 feet of snow, and it goes down 10 to 20 degrees below zero, and there's a very high risk of earthquake. So, for example, there are some things you can get the community to do in Afghanistan, but you wouldn't get them to build a school that's earthquake resistant. Maybe 30 to 40% of the schools, of the people who died in the Pakistan earthquake last fall, were children in school, because none of the schools were built according to earthquake standards. And if you want to sustain your school or your health clinic through one winter, you have to build it in a very hardy way. So you have to contextualize this. I wouldn't compare Afghanistan in construction standards with Bangladesh. The problem in Bangladesh is corruption, and it is much higher than it is even in Afghanistan, where we have problems with that too. I might add that the corruption problem in Bangladesh is not just in the government, and it's not just at the national ministry level. It gets into the private sector. It gets into some of the NGOs. The AID mission in Bangladesh has been there for like 40 years, so it's been there a very long time. And of the 8,000 people who work for AID worldwide, 6,000 are not Americans. They're third world nationals, and they're not just drivers. They're PhD economists, they're medical doctors, they're agricultural scientists, many with advanced degrees. And our entree into many of these countries at the grassroots level through the ministries is not the American Foreign Service staff. They manage the mission. It is the 6,000 Foreign Service nationals, many of whom, by the way, go on to become presidents of countries, prime minister. The new vice president of El Salvador is a woman who was a Foreign Service national in the AID mission for 10 years, got her master's degree with an AID scholarship. So one thing I would say is you need a highly decentralized management system, which we do in AID, and a lot of local staff who know the reality. Even if you've been there 40 years and you're not a Bengali, you don't quite get everything. You need some people there. I always actually would meet with the FSNs privately with no one else in the room to tell me what was really going on. because they always tell you very interesting stories that the embassy misses, and sometimes even the senior people in the mission miss about what's happening. And they can tell you, these people have a reputation that you don't want to get close to. These people have a wonderful reputation, and that helps to build the database to make decisions. I think what development is all about for all of us, not just AID, it's for DFID and the European Union and the World Bank, is to try to fund entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs. Muhammad Yunus got a lot of AID money when he started. I think people sometimes forget that the money didn't come from Yunus, it came from some donors, and AID was among the first, I think, to invest in him. And if you look at rice production in Bangladesh, it doubled in a 20-year period, and it doubled because of heavy investment in AID and the World Bank and the Rockefeller Foundation and the Green Revolution in the 1970s and 80s, and you can just see the rice increasing. So there was something done at scale that had a profound effect on nutrition and incomes, and other than the '74 famine, there has not been a famine in Bangladesh in several decades. So there is a series of things you can do. The Global Development Alliance was a new mechanism to try to capture money from corporations, universities, and foundations that we would not typically touch. And I'll give you one example. There's tens of billions of dollars that go back from the U.S. to the South in remittances each year, and there are always people, thinking, people have assumed for a long time, that this money goes back essentially for consumption. You buy food with it or clothing. In fact, a lot of the research now, the Inter-American Development Bank just issued a wonderful new book. In fact, I'm not sure it's out. I've seen the galley proof of it. The World Bank, there's a new unit in AID that's doing research on this. The World Bank's doing research on it. We did a thing with one of the banks in Haiti. We said, you agree to put 0.25%. You have to get each of your people submitting remittances from the diaspora in the United States in a separate fund. We will match the money, and we will take the two funds, and we will build a school with it. I opened the first school 3 years ago. And so this is done outside the Ministry of Education, though they had to approve it because they had to provide the teachers. But this bank now, as a conduit for remittances, is now helping to build schools. And the Haitian American diaspora is very, very enthusiastic about this because they like this stuff going back to their villages. That's a very non-traditional way of approaching this, but it's had a wonderful effect in Haitian villages where at the national level there's been high levels of instability.
Other questions? There's several over here. The microphone is on its way. Here we go.
I could just ask the question.
Here,
Oh,
just so everyone can hear.
for Jack, I think you've partly answered this question, but one of the things that I think is very important is to have people be trained by a peer-peer system so that somebody in Kenya is trained by somebody in Kenya who has been through the same experience. And speaking of Muhammad Yunus, there's the Grameen Replication Project, whereby the People's Bank of Nigeria is trained by Bangladeshis. And I think that kind of South-South training is a trend I would like to see continue. It might ultimately put aid people out of business, but it's a risk.
You should have more questions.
Okay, I cheer for putting aid people out of business. Let's collect a couple more questions and then let's have the panel respond. There's one there and one there. I don't know how many microphones there are floating around. Yes.
Hi, I'm Kate Brandt, and I'm here with the Roosevelt Institution. My question is actually for Mr. Sanchez. I was curious, in your work in Africa and elsewhere, what have you currently seen to be the role of appropriate technology? And do you see this as an area with growth potential in the global development?
Okay, since that was do you want more questions? Yeah. Collect a couple more?
Yeah.
Okay, let's get two more.
Tom Khalil from UC Berkeley. This is a question for Ruth, which is, tell us about the status of the proposal that you've been working on for the advanced market commitment for vaccines. Okay. And also, now that so much work has been done to develop the proposal, what political and advocacy work is needed to get G7 approval for all 6 vaccines moving beyond the current pilot?
Wow, I swear I didn't plant that question. Okay, one more and then we'll answer them. Yes. There's one right here.
Joe Wilson, UNDP. My question is to Pedro Sanchez. Could you explain more about the role of subsidies as far as the seeds were concerned? Had there been no subsidies, what would have been the effect? And is there a sunset clause on those subsidies so that the people or the farmers do not become dependent on subsidies? Thank you.
Okay, I think we've collected enough, particularly for you, Pedro. So why don't you take a couple of those?
Okay. Trained by locals? Absolutely. In our project, we have a very clear policy that we're just hiring local people from the same country or nearby countries, but by all means. And local training, it's been done beautifully, especially in Ethiopia by the government, in which they have trained about 5 extension agents in health and agriculture per village, and those people stay in the village. I don't think you're going to put AID out of business and all that, but what you may have, and AID, I'm not talking about the agency, but collectively our business, I think what we may have is a naturally a greater reliance on local people and less on non-local people, and I think this is healthy. Appropriate technology. The role of appropriate technology has been determined by science in the village together with the farmers. Some appropriate technologies like agroforestry, certainly the malaria bed nets would qualify there. Other ones, you may not think of them as appropriate technology, but I can tell you the antiretroviral drugs are really appropriate for people affected by AIDS, and they make a tremendous difference. We also use fertilizers and have nothing against fertilizers as long as they're properly used. They work faster, and actually they're initial before you can use organic fertilization technologies like agroforestry. They come later. They're interplanted, but they come later. So appropriate technology has to be scientifically correct. We found, for example, it was cheaper to extend the electricity grid funded by the World Bank into one of these villages than to try to go solar. So some of them are not appropriate in an economic sense yet. It's a local decision that's done jointly. Subsidies, I'm not sure which subsidies you were talking about. If you're talking about subsidies to U.S. agriculture and European agriculture and so on, or you're talking subsidies about seeds and so on. Absolutely. We think this is a paradigm shift. It was tried before, but it was corrupted. It was done by the government, and all sorts of corruption came in through. We think subsidy has to go through the private sector, through the development of agro-dealers who would handle fertilizer vouchers, using smart cards, using new technology that would minimize corruption. It won't prevent it, absolutely, but would minimize it. We have subsidized and continue to subsidize our farmers in the first world at the tune of $1 billion a day. So conceptually, I don't have, if we accept that, why should we have a different standard for the poorest people? What I can tell you is for sure that if you invest $60 in subsidies in terms of inputs in Malawi, you're going to save the balance from $400 of foreign aid. That food aid for these people is not going to do anything. It's not going to make them better farmers. It's not going to get them into the markets or anything else. If anything, will increase dependency. Investing at the front end is a good thing. It has to be handled, though, looking at the history before, primarily through the private sector.
And let me just very briefly respond to the question that was asked of me. It's about work that we did at the Center for Global Development over the past couple of years to look at the feasibility and desirability of an arrangement whereby a set of donors would promise in advance to pay for a vaccine for the developing world that's not yet developed, say a malaria vaccine, an AIDS vaccine, something like that, so that commercial pharmaceutical firms would have incentives to invest private funds in research and development and accelerate the scientific process to the extent possible. So it's work that we did, very much an example of an idea that started on a blackboard in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and made its way over about a 2-year process to the legal pads of the G7, scribbling the idea that this would be something that the G7 finance ministers would be interested in supporting. there will likely be some discussion of this, maybe an announcement at the World Bank IMF meetings in later this month. And I think you'll hear a little bit about this in the session on global health on Wednesday morning. So the question was, now that the finance ministers have said they're interested in this and maybe making a decision about it, what's the role of advocacy organizations to push it along, perhaps? And I think that's probably a question for advocacy organizations, but I think that what's very helpful in the process of getting research into real-world action is to have a sort of unified, relatively unified voice among key leaders and spokespeople in the field, say, for example, the field of global health in this case, so that the policymakers, who have, frankly, about a minute and a half to devote to any particular topic, don't spend that minute and a half hearing this view and that view and the other view and the fifth view, but rather they hear one unified view. This is a good thing to do. You will go to heaven faster if you do it. And we will be behind you if you take this risk. So I'm not in the advocacy community, but if I had one wish for what that would look like, it would be a unified message. And Jessica, actually, maybe I could ask you to comment if you agree with me about that, the idea that at some point, eventually, there needs to be a kind of collective unified message to policymakers, if possible.
If possible, it's just that so many of the issues that we're all involved with are uncertain and controversial, and so, I mean, I agree with you that often climate change is a perfect example in where we have the advocacy community in this country split right down the middle between two different approaches, and the Senate is split right along with it. And the result is in an inability to do anything. So, and I know exactly what you're feeling of when the best becomes the enemy of the good. It's just sometimes hard to achieve.
Are there other questions? We have maybe about 5 more minutes or so. There's one way back there. Oh, we got one closer there. Okay.
Go ahead. Hi, this question is for Pedro, probably. Is there any, do they do any soil testing to quickly determine a better crop that has more nutritional value than possibly what they're using, or is that too difficult a policy?
Let's take one more question and then we'll wrap up. There's one more question back there.
I believe the number on the slide was the government, the local government or national government is contributing $30 per capita out of the $110 per capita in the villages. Mm-hmm. Can you talk to me about, is that donor community funding, how that money is handled, how that money travels, and the transparency and accountability for that piece of it? Thank you.
Great. Pedro, you're getting your fair share of questions.
Hi, my own fair share. No, on the first question, there are all sorts of soil tests, but they'll basically tell you what kind of nutrients you need to apply. There are no soil tests for telling you what different crops you should use. Certainly, what we can say is the crop, in order to diversify the diet, you need to diversify the crops. Farmers won't listen to you until they had a big harvest and they have a surplus. Once they have a surplus, they do want to diversify into things like soybeans and cowpeas and peanuts and dairy cattle and fruit trees and spices and stuff that would have a high value, low volume product out. So the tendency is there. What I don't believe is trying to change the mentality of the African farmer who would only grow corn or maize where he should be growing sorghum because it's a very dry area. That's not going to happen. I don't think we're into that kind of a chain. in terms of the social part of the crop mix. But shifting from the staple crop to one crop to a suite of crops to diversify both the nutrition and the income, that's for sure. On the second question, $10 per capita per year are from the villagers. And we haven't finished quantifying their contribution because you have to monetize a non-monetizable contribution because none of that is in cash. It looks like they've exceeded that. $30 per capita per year from the government. As I mentioned, it's about 3 times as much as the government contributes right now. But they are seconding extension agents. They're seconding people from the Ministry of Health. Once we monetize that, the electricity grid is getting to some of these places, including in Ethiopia, which is 54 kilometers away from the main electricity grid, paid by the government. So we'll see if they're doing that. The remaining $70 is from, quote, the donor community, whether it's NGO or official donors or philanthropists or whatever. And of that, what my institution has done is gather resources for 50 of those $70. And we're investing those, but no cash goes there. Goes as malaria bed nets, or as cement for a roof, or as fertilizer, or as seed, but no cash get there. We are keeping a close accounting on all that, so we'll be able to quantify exactly how that went.
If I could just add one little thing in terms of the issue of inputs in Africa. We found in research that after a major disaster, a famine or a civil war or natural disaster, that people are much more willing to take risks and make changes because of what they've been through. They're traumatized. And that's true in the north as well in the south. It's true after the earthquakes in California. New technologies were increased, 90% coverage in California households. After, in the 6 months following an earthquake, when it was for 20 years, they wouldn't install this very simple technology in their homes. And so what we did, I introduced this when I was in AID in the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance 16 years ago, and that is to make agreements with all of the major CGIAR research facilities in corn, sorghum, millet, rice, to get new varieties that were improved varieties that were done through these research centers. In fact, Pedro headed for 10 years a preeminent center in Kenya, one of these centers from the part of the CGIAR network. And we introduced this seed, which was new, and so the farmers normally would resist this. But this was after a famine when we were giving them the seed as part of a famine recovery effort, or after a civil war. And the study showed after doing this for 10 years that 25% of the improved varieties of seed introduced in Africa, the whole continent, were from emergency programs because of this notion of using the technology in the CGIAR network and using the NGO community in the rehabilitation program, because we'd never been using improved varieties from the scientific research that was done. A lot of the scientific research, the seeds got to the larger scale farmers, but not to the poorest people. And of course, these programs in rehabilitation are all focused just on the poorest people. And so it was very successful, more so than any of us realized when we started doing this in the early 1990s. It was, I think, 91 we initiated. It was quite fascinating, the research that came out on it.
Well, I think Andrew Natsios has given us our closing metaphor, which is the idea of planting seeds, the ideas, in places where they can grow and flourish with often surprising results. So thank you very much for your questions, which enriched the session, and your attention. Thanks to our speakers. And you now have until 3 o'clock, I'm told, when you're asked to reconvene for the next session. Thank you very much.
Pedro, it's nice to see you. Good to see you. Yeah.